Hello, everyone. So for this for this assignment, we'll be going over sentence unpacking. So for this one, we will be able to determine the meanings in densely packed sentences by performing sentence unpacking so that we may focus on the language and the meaning of the text. I'm not sure if you felt this way, but the language used within the age of responsibility can be a little heavy. So we want to make sure that we're able to go in and unpack these sentences so that we're extracting the correct meaning from them. So when proficient readers encounter challenging sentences in an academic text, they slow down and unpack the sentences so they understand all the meanings in them. In this activity, you'll have a chance to practice how to unpack challenging sentences from the Greenblatt article. Use the process below to unpack some grammatically complex sentences. Use your dictionary or dictionary.com to look up unknown words as needed. So, sentence unpacking, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it, but it has a few goals. So, when we first approach a sentence, number one, what we want to do is try to get the gist of the sentence. We want to, what's the gist of the sentence before we analyze it? What's going on here? We want to understand it better. We'll understand it better after we unpack it. But when we first come up to it, we want to ask ourselves, what is this sentence even saying? Next, we're going to unpack the sentence to get all the meanings. We're going to ask ourselves, what's happening? Who or what is involved? What are the circumstances surrounding the action? When, where, in what ways? Then we focus on the meaning. We identify the meaningful chunks or pieces in the sentence with slash marks right here. And then I'll show you guys how to do that too. What does the chunk mean in your own words, right? So we're breaking up each little piece, and then we're doing little meanings from each piece in order to find the big meaning of the whole sentence. We focus on language, so we want to ask ourselves what we notice about the language the author chose to use. How does this language make meanings in specific ways? And then after that, we translate it. What does the sentence mean in your own words? So very similar to the summarizing section activity, we're taking these sentences and we're rewording them, we're translating them in order to condense them, make them more compact, and make them easier for us to understand. So here's an example. You guys may remember this is from, the first paragraph of the article, of the Greenblatt article. So it reads, at 23, police officer Justin McNall could pursue lawbreakers at 100 miles per hour, but couldn't rent a car. This is one example of the contradictory, confusing expectations states often place on young people when it comes to the age of responsibility. So you'll see here I already put the slashes in, but I'll go ahead and break them up, and then I'll show you how to do one without them already there. So at 23, we put a slash there because that can be its own thing, right? Why is that meaningful? So we get his age right away. Police officer Justin McNall, I'm going to put another slash in because I get who he is, right? Who is this guy? Police officer Justin McNall. Could pursue lawbreakers at 100 miles per hour. And I put another slash and I separated it because that's a significant event, right? What was he allowed to do? He could pursue lawbreakers at 100 miles per hour. And remember, we talked about that on Friday because that shows how contradictory this age of responsibility really is. But couldn't rent a car, right? So he could pursue slash, but he couldn't rent a car. This is one example. And with these, I wouldn't worry too much about separating like the verbs from the articles. I would just do it like this. This is one example of the contradictory, confusing expectations. Frozen, right? So that's why do we make that separate? Because that was a chunk that revealed that this is contradictory and confusing, right? That's what we got the meaning just from that alone. And states often place on young people. Separated that by a slash and a slash because as we talked about on Friday, the age of responsibility is oftentimes imposed upon us and not self-derived. And I would just do it like this. when it comes to age and responsibility. And that is a separate chunk because that kind of separates it. And I'll go over this one more time because I know that was kind of confusing. And in terms of translating, though, we want it to be in our own words. So when I rewrote this, I said when Justin McNall was 23, he was unable to rent a car even though he was an active police officer who could often engage in dangerous pursuits. This reveals the irony when it comes to the age of responsibility, since McNall is considered old enough to risk his life, but not old enough to rent a car. So as you'll see, it's very similar to summarizing what went on here, but I'm more rewording it, right? I'm kind of condensing it. I am putting it into my own words so that it's easier for me to personally understand. So let's go ahead and do another one. And what you guys will do is copy the sentence that comes up here, that shows up here, and then you're going to paste it in the unpack. But unpack the sentences below following the sentence unpacking protocol. Remember, there's no 100% way to unpack it. I'm not grading on where you put your slashes. I'm looking more at what you were thinking when you were putting those slashes in. Are they randomly placed, or did you try to make meaning from the sentence and translate it? So don't worry about, oh my gosh, like is Mr. Rick's going to dock me for having enough slashes, not enough? I'm looking more at are you able to look at a sentence, break it down, and translate it or rewrite it in a way that makes sense to you. So let's say this was my first sentence. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to copy it, I'm going to go into this first guy, and I'm going to paste it. Then I'm going to read it before I go ahead and start unpacking it. States are using a new approach to driver's licensing called graduated driver licensing in order to deal with the challenge of both allowing teens to access mobility. I'm going to reread that part. Of both allowing teens access to the mobility of licenses and managing the risks of allowing teens to drive. So the first thing that stands out to me is states. So I'm going to put a slash there, and the reason that I'm thinking that is because that's the subject, the main thing that we're talking about. Who's doing all this? It's states, which means it's coming from a government level. So they're using a new approach. So I'm going to slash that out because it's a new approach. So like they're changing things up, right? It's not the same as how we used to do driver's licenses, but they're coming with a new way of how to approach it, called graduated driver's licensing. So I'm going to split that up because what is it called? It's a new approach of states, new approach, new driver's licensing called graduated driver's licensing. So we're kind of breaking it down, right? In order to deal with the challenge. So they realize that there's a challenge going on here, right? There's a challenge with the age of responsibility. And as we see in the rest of the sentence, the challenge lies somewhere in allowing teens to access the mobility of license and managing the risk of teens, right? Because they're not necessarily statistically they get in a lot of accidents. So by both allowing teens to access the mobility of license, so let's spit that. So that's part one of why they're implementing those changes, and managing the risk of allowing teens to drive, right? So they're managing it. So that's how we split up our sentence, right? And again, this sentence had a lot fewer slashes than that sentence. But if I was looking at this and you were the student who completed this, I could see what your thoughts were as you were splitting this up, right? States, who did it? States. What are they doing? A new approach. A new approach to what? Driver's licensing, called graduated driver's licensing. Well, why are they doing that? In order to deal with the challenge. Challenge of what? Both allowing teens to access mobility of license, part one, and managing the risk of allowing teens to drive. And in the translate section, that's when I would go ahead and reword this, right? And I don't want to do this for you because I want to make sure that you get enough practice with this as possible. But this one, we can take a look at, and I'll start to do part of it with you. States are using a new approach called graduated driver's licensing. So let's start there. So let's say as, let me type, as a new approach Come on. All right, sorry about that. I had technical difficulties. So we would want to start with something along the lines of as a I'm done for today.